the changes ongoing. See if I can get this out of the way. Yes, the tremendous changing in the vision of governments in many countries in the world, luckily, after the conventions, is implementation of legislation, and legislation that will drive a lot of change. Of course, there's always a lot of voluntary actions. There is a new young generation like yourself, students, who are much more aware of climate and climate change, and to create a better world for the next generations that my generation was. I'm impressed by that, and I'm very happy to participate in that. And I think I can show you today in a number of slides that legislation drives to a market and creates a market, and with that, all the things that you have been learning in the lectures earlier this week, if I've seen the topics, will work out in a better and different way, because it's legislation, because companies have to adjust their systems and processes and products, and therefore a market is created, and basically money is available to invest in green technology, but also in the growth and the development of biomass. And that's an important part of the presentation today. Let me briefly introduce my company. Let's see. Dutch Mountain Trading. I founded the company in 2016 with the view to trade natural raw materials for chemicals and for biofuels. I've been in the industry for 20 years, but I will tell you a little more about that after this slide. We trade forestry chemicals, resins, and turpentines, also fatty materials that comes from pine trees in different ways. We've been working with the Indonesian state forestry company, Perumtani, and market their products in Europe. We also work with US companies who produce pine chemicals that derive as a waste stream from the pulp and paper process. With all the developments in the energy transition and the development of biofuels, we spend a lot of time these days to find sources and develop sources for raw material, or in other words, for raw material is feedstocks for these advanced biofuels. And what are advanced biofuels? I think I will tell a little bit more in the slides to come. As consultants, we work for a major European fuel company to find enough biomass, enough raw materials for this company to produce enough biofuels to comply with the legislation in Europe. And that legislation drives to the use of much more biofuels, and therefore there is a strong need for every fuel company in Europe to find more biomass and the right biomass. And I will tell more about that. Our company, Dutch Mountain, is based in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. I think within the biofuel industry, Rotterdam is the center of the industry. With we have over 7 refineries in the areas. Many refineries are transformed into biorefineries. New biorefineries are being constructed here. There's tremendous amount of storage in the harbor areas of all kinds of vegetable oils and raw materials for biofuels. And a lot of pricing and agreements are all based on Rotterdam prices. It's a coincidence. I'm born and raised here. I studied here, so not a coincidence that I ended up in this industry. But we have a good perspective here what's going on. But this is a very global industry, not so much the end products and the markets which are used here in Europe, but the raw materials come from everywhere. I think I had a short introduction. My name is Maurits Berg. I'm 50 years of age. I'm married with 3 daughters, 2 in university. One is traveling around in a year, in between year in Australia, so it's a bit closer to you. I have had over 20 years in natural raw materials in different companies. I started to work in the chemical industry for a Dutch multinational called AkzoNobel, who used a lot of vegetable oils and resins for paint production and paper chemical production. The use of natural raw materials in products is not new. Actually, most of the products were made from natural products before oil was even found. However, the chemical industry, the industry based on fossil materials, on fossil raw materials and molecules, have pushed out a lot of natural raw materials over the last, 6-7 decades, and or even longer. And we, as the suppliers of natural raw materials, always have to compete with this very efficient process of pumping up oil and putting that in crackers and creating the right molecules for all kind of products that we know today, with the plastics as the biggest example, but there are many more. We realize that that's something that cannot continue, and that contributes very much to climate change and many other negative effects on our environment, and we slowly started to change that. But I must say that the fuel industry is ahead of the materials or the chemical industry with the creation of legislation. As said, over 20 years, I've always been able to promote our green material as positive, and everybody enjoyed already the idea that you purchase sustainable raw materials, renewable raw materials, products that basically never end up, but the industry was never willing to pay for it. And with that, our market shares remained somewhat limited. Basically, in the materials industry, you can say that 10% of all the products are made out of natural raw materials. In the fuel industry, it's basically, in Europe, it's similar today. 10% of the fuel in gasoline, diesel, is already made of natural raw materials. That is not yet the case for aviation fuel or maritime fuels. However, legislation is coming and agreements are coming, and more biofuels, fuels on natural raw materials, are used in these products as well. I think that's a bit of a broader introduction. I think we're gonna have a look in my story about global energy use, the use of biofuels, the legislation that is implemented in Europe, a little bit of technology, but I'm sure you had already a lot of technology during the lectures earlier this week, so we only briefly touch upon that. And then I'm going to do a little bit economics, environmental economics, maybe I have to call it, because as I mentioned, if you have to battle on an open and free market against fossil material, fossil fuels, it's hard because producing those materials are very cheap, and it's in principle more expensive to produce fuels on natural raw materials. But then, you take into account that if you produce the materials, your fuels on natural raw materials in the right way, and I'll come back to that, the right way, you put all the costs, also hidden costs, in the product, and the effects of climate change and all costs associated, and on social and an environmental cost that are not included in the price of ordinary fossil fuel these days. And I think if we develop biofuels on the right raw materials, on the right feedstock, we can include all these aspects and fight climate change and make the environment, biodiversity and so forth much better. elements in the presentation will come back on this topic. So let us have a brief look at this slide, which is showing the world energy transition. The source of this information and this data comes from BP, formerly British Petroleum, a large energy and fuel company, company who's really in the middle of a transition from their traditional earnings models with fossil fuels and all related towards, working more into the direction of renewables, simply because of in the future there will be not a market anymore for their products. These products will not, be able to be used anymore. Talking about gasoline and later on also diesel, fossil based. If you look at today or 2019, you see the mixture of the different energies. It's largely fossil based and a very small percentage renewable. The total energy consumption in the world will increase, of course, with the developing economies in different continents. At the same time, it's not a linear growth. There's a lot of measures to reduce energy consumption, to become more efficient. So there is growth, but on the other hand, you will also see even a reduction in certain parts of the world already of the total energy uses. But as important as that is that we change the energy sources, and in order to meet the agreements and to reduce greenhouse gases in the future, as we agreed in the United Nations conventions, we have to change the energy mix in the way that is presented here by BP, with a tremendous large amount of renewables. And for that is a tremendous amount of biomass necessary. And that's basically what we're going to talk about today as well. I think it's what you hear here in Europe is that everybody talks about solar, everybody talks about wind energy, but biomass is a very important one as well. It has a little bit of a negative image these days. I come back to that. It has to do with, are you gonna use valuable food sources like soya oil, rapeseed oil, sources that can be used for several food production, and throw that material in your gasoline tank. That's probably not the right way to do it. Especially not with the shortages of these materials to feed the world everywhere. It's very actual at the moment with the war in the Ukraine, where vegetable oil prices go through the roof, where there's a shortage of everything, but also in a normalized world, this is probably not the way to move forward. And therefore, different biomass types are being developed for fuels and bioenergy to contribute to climate change or contribute to the reduction of climate change, I have to say. And this slide is a very nice overview from BP to see where they, with all the calculations and the smart people and the cooperation with universities that they have, make the simulations as where an energy mix probably has to go to reach the targets and to keep temperature increases on Earth in a limitation of 1.5 or probably 2 degrees. Let's go to the next slide. As mentioned, in renewables, bioenergy, renewables is also wind and solar and water, but bioenergy is a very important factor. It's an important source that's going to be there, that we have to further develop. I also explained that if you use and grow biomass for bioenergy in the right way, it only has positive effects. It contributes to carbon capture, for example. It renovates or reforestates areas which are depleted today, where nothing is happening, and the obligation to use biomass in legislation enables business models for large reforestation projects in area where there was basically no money for available to do so. So I believe it's definitely on a win-win for the environment, but also for land restoration, for the growth of forests, and with that to a better environment for the people. It brings also a lot of work for people in areas where there is not much work at this moment. And that's all driven by legislation and by the need to fight climate change. There has been a lot ongoing already. And of course, we always talk we are late and too late to fight climate change, but it's not said that nothing happened, and you have to start somewhere. And you know, in the 80s and 90s, probably 90s, we started basically, and in the first 20 years of the century, you could see a tremendous growth in the use of bioenergy, and we have here biofuel consumption. You see a little dip in 20, where we had, of course, the Corona crisis, where people traveled less and used much less fuels, diesel and gasoline. But that's a temporary thing. I think we're going to be back on the levels, and with legislation implemented in many places in the world, we will see this steep increase curve continue to go for a very long time in the coming decades. And on one hand, we focus in Europe very much on electrification of the automobiles. First, the cars. I think legislation has been implemented and gets forcer to not sell any cars in 2035 with a combustion engine anymore. I think the automotive industry doubts if we can reach that date, but if legislation is ambitious and the target is strong, and basically the money becomes available from society to do and make that change, then we're gonna be very close. And you will see diesel cars and gasoline cars disappear step by step. And if it's not going to be 2035, when the latest combustion engine is sold, it's maybe 5 years later. And then with another 10 years or 15 years, most of those cars are disappeared. And probably the infrastructure with gasoline stations and all that will disappear as well. It's already a decreasing market when it comes to consumption of gasoline and diesel. For trucking and long-haul trucking, it's going to be a bit longer, or much longer. But anyway, that's something which definitely goes on beyond 2040, 2050, before other systems will take over completely. We hear all kind of positive developments there on hydrogen and so forth, and that's probably going to take place. But again, we talk about a time frame of at least the next 25 years. And then we talk about, transportation fuels on the road, which are not the most difficult ones. I live in the Netherlands, and after Norway and Denmark, I believe we are one of the most electrified countries already, with a lot of loading stations and infrastructure. And that market was kind of created by tax incentives and by very high taxes on gasoline. And zero taxes on electric cars. It's been a great success. And today, from every car, over 20% in the Netherlands, which is being sold, it's electric. That number grows very fast, and that will continue. So why you just said in this graph that the curve will continue to rise very steep. Well, then we look at two other huge industries, which is the aviation industry and the marine industry. And also those industries need to go on biofuels and are much harder to change into other technologies than the cars where we drive in. I also hear fantastic stories about, first planes they're gonna run on electricity or on hydrogen. But if you really go deeper and more fundamental in the technology which is necessary, the materials which are necessary to do that in a real sustainable way, in the right way, it's really hard to say how long it will take. But it takes definitely much longer than the industries I just mentioned. The first countries have mandated biofuel mixtures in aviation. The first country was Norway. Now Sweden, France follow. And I think from a European perspective, it will come. So it will become a European legislation, and step by step, the mixing of biofuels in aviation increases. And the same for the maritime sector. That is not yet started, although in the Netherlands there is a nice exchange program where you get credits if you produce fuels for the maritime industry, and you can use those credits in the road transportation. But that's still to come. So what I do expect is many more decades of growing demand for fuels for those industry, and with that for biomass. On the right side, we see BP's outlook on where should those biomasses come from, and how should we make those biofuels on a responsible way. And here you can see the residues from the agricultural industry. Often we take only a very small part of the product that's growing on the field for food production, and then there's a large waste amount that could be transferred with all kinds of new technologies, and often cellulosic material, into fuels. I think you had lectures before earlier this week on this, and that's basically the same for forestry residues. We have a big problem with manure in Europe, and if you can transfer that in a very useful biofuel, it's fantastic. Same story for municipal waste. Change solid waste in the fuels. I think in the UK, the first trial factory or the first industrial scale factory is being built. And technology is quickly developed to improve that. It's not like a matter of 5 or 10 years that all that is worked out, and we have tremendous quantities of fuel coming out of municipality waste. But trust me, when we 10 years down the road or 15 years, you will see a significant revolution in that. On top, we have the waste oils. I come back to that. Waste oils are already there, are implemented in the system. There are basically two types: used cooking oil and animal fats. If you produce meat, you have a lot of fat from the animals, and that fat is also used in fuels. That's already widely implemented. It's existing technology. Many of the other technologies or sources, technology have to be developed, and even also the sources have to be, prepared and developed to become a stable source for biomass or for feedstock for biofuels. And we have a look to Europe, and I think it's probably the participation of this course is widely from Asia, Indonesia in particular, but several other countries as well. If we briefly look at the world, I think that there are a few places where things are going a bit faster. In America, it's the state of California, which has very advanced legislation. And with the legislation drives a growing industry for biomass, biofuel. In Europe, we have a few countries which are the absolute top of the world, which are the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. They are far ahead, and their percentages of uses of biomass in transportation fuel or all energy production is far away from any other country, probably in the world, but definitely also in Europe. And they show us the way how to do it. They have the advantage that they have smaller populations and huge surface and a lot of forestry. But anyway, it is legislation that has been implemented earlier than anywhere else that has led to that success and to that industry. But if you see that, like, road transportation in Europe takes about a third of the energy consumption, and with that 22% of the emissions, and there are probably other energy sources that take care of more emissions. So it's not completely linear. And in road transport, we already use about 10% of biofuels. The other 90% is basically still reliance on oil. There's a little bit electric these days, but you see it's a percent. And biofuel sets on 5% in this graph. And that also has to do that in this graph, the maritime fuel or the inland vessels are also built in. So if you really look to road transport, it's a bit higher. And then I come back basically on the initial development of biofuels. And for that, they take, say, easy feedstocks, and with easy I mean feedstocks that you can with relative easy technology transfer in a fuel, in a biodiesel or bioethanol. But these sources are also used to produce all kinds of food and feed. And the largest vegetable oil, and we talk about oil and ethanol, alcohol production. Alcohol production comes from sugarcane, from corn. All food sources. Biodiesel comes from palm oil, from soya oil, from rapeseed oil, the largest, say, oil crops around the world, and are therefore highly under discussion. Those are the numbers on the left side. On the right side, we have some sort of a, say, set of circles that represent basically the change towards where we want to go to, and on which legislation, modern legislation, is built. And I come back to the timeline of legislation, but on the left side, we basically say, okay, lots of the bioenergy of the biofuels being used in Europe, but also in Indonesia, for example, are based on those oil sources that also have, a negative impact or another impact on food, on biodiversity. Then I talk palm in Indonesia, for example. And that is something that we think it's not good, should change. And if you look in how should you wish that the biomass sources are, developing, there has been a lot of thinking, especially in Europe, but also in other places. And the first objective is what you see on the bottom. It's, the reduction of greenhouse gases, because they have an impact on climate change, on the rise of the temperature, with all that. But if you go a bit broader, I think you also look at things like biodiversity and an ecosystem itself. So if you only grow crops from all these sources, it does not have a positive impact. So that should change. And therefore you make an impact assessment. Which kind of crops, which kind of biomass can you grow, and where should you grow it to make it have a positive impact? Firstly, on greenhouse gas reduction, but secondly, on other things like biodiversity and healthy ecosystem, but also all kinds of, sustainability and social criteria. land, there's a lot of land in the world, but there are also a lot of people. And if you want to use the land in the right way, you have to do that in coherence with social development, with what we say sustainability, in the sense that we don't produce one kind of trees, for example, or crops, and that you make sure that everybody has enough food. It all comes together, and then the puzzle is not as easy as it initially looked like. So basically in Europe and also in the US and other places, we started a bit simple and used the biosources which were available and could easily transformed into a model. If you look now at the impact of that, we have reconsiderations, and in Europe we believe we have to do a better job and use other sources. And one of the most important sources that people think of then is waste material, which is not used or is burned. And if you could transfer that in a fuel, then you have a second use of that waste, and produces at least not more greenhouse gases when it's being burned in a combustion engine, rather than in an open fireplace or other location. And with that, we have basically the transfer in this presentation to legislation. I think I mentioned it already, and I cannot stop mention it enough. It's so important to have legislation to do this. The free market does not provide the right conditions to fight climate, to create a system and a market for products that do not harm the environment, do not contribute to the increase of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It needs to be regulated. And this is what we more and more believe. I think yesterday we could see a big success in North America of the Biden administration to get a tremendous stimulus package to fight climate change and come with all these measures to improve greenhouse gas reduction. I think we're a little ahead in Europe on that. On the other hand, in the US, you see a tremendous increase also in activities around the growth of biofuel productions, refineries being built, tremendous amount of capex. There's a lot of additional land being used for feedstock production. In most of the states, they still have a bit of a different philosophy and are still very much focused on crops that also can be used for food production. And they don't see on the continent of North America, not directly the risk on influence on food production. So it's a bit different than Europe, but what we at least see is a tremendous positive development. In Europe, we have seen, and maybe you have heard a little bit about that, during the pandemic, we had the Green Deal, followed by Fit for 55, tremendous EU programs with hundreds of billions of money to boost the energy transition and to make investments available to get that transition going. And that's going to be a tremendous stimulus that is going along with legislation where the industry is forced to work on energy reduction, energy consumption reduction, but also on getting those new technologies implemented and being in place. The Energy Directive number 2 indicates that there is a number 1. I come to that. We are currently in the period where we...
Gak panik deh.
Okay. The Renewable Energy Directive was implemented in 2009. It took definitely many years to prepare and to get all the member states in the EU agreeing with that. So in the early 2000s, we started to develop legislation, and that ran in principle to 2020. In the end of 2018, we as Europe, or the European legislators, agreed on new legislation that was finally implemented and in place in 2022, started this year. So this year, at the end of 2022, all the fuel companies must comply with this legislation, and I will tell you a bit more what that brings. And as I mentioned, during the pandemic and during, let's say, the conventions, the EU has committed to a much more ambitious package. So basically, the RED II is already going to be adjusted. Some people speak about the RED III. Some speak from a more ambitious RED II. It's not so important, but the numbers of amounts of biofuels that have to be blended in are going to be significantly higher. The electrification process must go faster, and there's a lot of money available. But let me basically start to introduce RED II versus RED I. RED I was, pure on biomass, blend in on volumes, a certain amount of fuel, and reach by 2020 the 10%. And it did not really matter where that was coming from. If you look at the RED II, there's got a tremendous change in feedstock sources. And that's a bit difficult because you have biofuels and biofuels feedstocks. And feedstocks, raw materials, are the sources where they come from. So it's not so much the technology, what kind of biofuel or how you produce it, it's the feedstock which is important now in the legislation. And as I mentioned, it's very obvious that if you could change waste material into a biofuel, there's a tremendous win in greenhouse gas reduction, and it's a very obvious source of feedstock to stimulate. And that is what basically this legislation, the RED II, does. On one hand, they have a sub-target that at the end of 2030, we need to have 3.5% of all the biofuels, gasoline and diesel, based on feedstock that used to be waste. And that's going to be what they call in our industry a very famous annex in legislation, Annex 9, Part A, a very ambitious target. And in order to obtain that, it also gets a stimulus. They have a method what we call double count. So I mentioned the 3.5%, but if you look at the absolute volume, because you can double count this material, if you basically blend in half, you already comply with the legislation. And that brings a tremendous stimulus to develop technologies that you probably have heard of in the earlier lectures, to use and introduce more and more waste material in the feedstock pool. A second annex is based on waste oils and fats that already are used. And why do we need to bring in that, say, separate target for this category of materials? We talk about used cooking oils and animal fats. There's only a certain amount of animal fats coming from, say, food production, meat production. And, it's already used also in the chemical industry. So if you allow the industry to use much more of this material, it's likely not coming from that source. And that's the same for used cooking oils. Or, animal fats from far over the world, all kinds of places are being brought to Europe. And then Europe is in compliance with their ambitious targets. But, the other continents cannot use those animal fats for their fuels and biofuels anymore. And in total, we do not win anything because, we have to pay a lot of energy, or we need a lot of energy to bring those feedstocks to Europe. So we don't see in that case too much of the the positive effects. Used cooking oils has a history, and if you start to implement a biofuel industry and you make legislation, you cannot predict all side effects. But one of the side effects was that with the stimulus and the price being paid for used cooking oil, it's sometimes attractive to buy fresh, what we call virgin oil, oil that is just produced from palm, for example, and not used for anything, and sell it as used cooking oil and get a premium in price. And that's absolutely not what the legislators in Europe want, because that's kind of fraud. And that happened big time. We had traders and producers of so-called used cooking oils, doing all this, using virgin oils, and some ended up in jail. It's a very serious offense. And in order to, avoid that stimulants, the EU said we're going to limit the use of those two categories of oils and fats, because we know it's a limited amount available anyway. It should also be used in other regions, so it should not be all brought to Europe, and therefore there is what they call a cap on that. Very technical, very specific. I just mention it. I think for today it's a bit complicated to continue in great detail. I hope I explained this, but these were really negative side effects from the first legislation, the red one. And in this way, the legislators here try to adjust that. And then they further look at what we just said, sources. It should not come from food sources. So there's a specific cap on food feedstock, and then I talk about palm, soya, rapeseed, and a few others, so that material cannot be used more. So if the targets of the total quantities of biofuels must increase, they cannot use those sources more. So they can keep what they have at the 2020 level, and everything that they source more must come from waste material, from the existing quantities of animal fats and used cooking oils, and materials which are newly developed under very strict conditions. So no forestry materials not produced on land where in the last 10 years there was food production, for example. It's going to be very technical and complicated, but it has to do with the fact that if you don't describe that in legislation very precisely, there's going to be a lot of negative effects. If there's a lot of money being paid because of the legislators determine that for oils from certain trees, then you will see, like the growth of the palm oil industry, that every other crop and product is taken away from that piece of land, and that very profitable crop will be planted there, and that has tremendous side effects on carbon, but also biodiversity and everything we don't want. So you have to build in a tremendous amount of detailed rules in legislation to avoid that. But basically, the legislators say, if today land is used for food production, or there's already forestry, or there's a high biodiversity, and there's a whole set of criteria, then you cannot use that land for any material that's going to be in the future producing biomass for biofuels. If you find degraded land and you're able to grow any kind of biomass on that, then at least the end result of the greenhouse gas emissions should be a savings from 50 to 70%, much higher than in the past. So it's not even allowed to build factories, technologies, plantations, even on land where nothing was growing for the last 10 years, if you don't reach those savings. And that's very ambitious, and that's not so easy. And that's exactly the ambition of the EU, to stimulate industries to create that. And it's possible to do so, but it's also more expensive. and it's more complicated and it's pretty new. And to do so, the EU has built in a lot of incentives and tax advantages for industries, agricultural and industrial, to create a supply line, a value chain that provide those advantages and not the disadvantage of the biofuel of the first generation. And if you try to put a lot of those details that are in this legislation, and I'm not going to talk about everyone here because it has a tremendous amount of details, and it's a biorefining course, and this is about legislation. But the reason I spend time on it, and I think the reason that I'm able to talk about it, is you can create refineries and technologies and all kinds of factories to produce fuels for the industry and for the market. But as long as the biomass are not produced in the right way, it will have negative effects. If you organize it in the right way, probably it's more expensive. It's for sure more expensive, but it has a lot of positive side effects. If you grow forests and other crops on land that hasn't been used for a long time, it creates a tremendous amount of carbon sinks. It captures carbon. It creates work for people. It makes the land and soil better. It fights erosion. It makes the environment more pleasant to live in. If there's nothing growing on large pieces of land, wind can have a tremendous effect and creates an environment which is unpleasant and brings a lot of erosion with it. Forests have a tremendous positive effect on a lot of things. And if you create modern forests with products that bring value as well, and you can produce from those forests also biofuels, for which the consumers around the world have to pay more, but we all together fight climate change, and it makes the environment better in those places. It has a positive effect. If you want to put that in legislation, you end up with a lot of detailed text, and I see a lot of developments everywhere on crop development. I think you have presentations on it that take that into perspective and basically make the world better, not only when it comes to temperature and climate change, but also to the whole environment. But the most important are you cannot use sources that feedstock sources that are currently used for food production, and it should not have a negative effect on land use change in the sense that you take a forest away to make another forest. I mean, it must have the reduction in greenhouse gas in total. Trying to summarize, because there's a lot of dry text and people are interested can easily download it. The whole text is you Google Renewable Energy Directive 2 and you come to the EU websites and you get all detailed text and a lot of other documentation around it. It's all in the public domain. But if you try to summarize it, what I just tried to describe is here in percentages basically, and I come to the absolute numbers as well in the next slide, is that we have to bring in, say, from 10% to 14% in the next 10 years. That was decided in 2018, and the development of this legislation started in 2015. The numbers that are being mentioned and negotiated today are much higher than the 14%. In the Fit for 55, it goes to 30%. But that new legislation has not been completed yet. But there are fierceful discussions in EU, the European Commission, in the member states in the parliament to come to those to new legislation that makes the numbers even much higher. But today we deal with this Renewable Energy Directive number 2, where we have to grow to 14% in total, and that we have to build in subcategories with a new category that is based on waste feedstocks, and that goes from 0 to 3.5% in 2030. And 2022 is the first year where we have to go to 0.2%. And that sounds very, very small, but in quantity, it's already ambitious. I mentioned about the two annexes, part A, part B. You see that the red line is kept stable, goes even a bit down. And that is because you don't want to use more of those materials because there is just not more available. And also the big gray part is the part that comes from conventional fuels, food and feed crop materials. We talk palm, soya, rapeseed. Then in the next slide, I think we see quantity-wise what that more or less means. We've done a lot of calculations, and David, my intern, has worked on this and came to the absolute numbers. If you see to all biofuels in the red two, we have to go to 18 million tons. 18 million tons basically also have more than 18 million tons of feedstock necessary. Tremendous amounts of numbers. 10 million tons for part A. And because it's double of 7 million, but then 3.5 million tons of waste materials that should be biofuels, waste materials that should be in your gasoline tanks in Europe by 2030. 3.5 million tons is tremendous amounts. There are factories being built, huge factories by companies like Neste, by Shell, but they built 1 million ton, 800,000, 500,000 ton factories to deal with those waste feedstocks and produce that biofuels necessary to reach the 3.5 million tons. There are already big factories. The Italian ENI has 2 traditional refineries reconstructed into a biorefinery. Total in France has reconstructed 1 and is constructing another and plans to do a 3rd one. Shell is doing here in Rotterdam a tremendous reconstruction of the traditional refinery. So there's a lot happening. I would call it more a revolution than an evolution. It's not a stepwise. What's now going in investments in steel is tremendous. Related to that, investments in green, in biomass will become huge as well, because you have to find a tremendous amount of biomass, which you cannot easily source from, soya or palm production. That has to be developed to fill those factories so that the fuel companies can comply with the legislation. These numbers are revolutionary, and it influences not only Europe, because all those feedstocks cannot be produced in Europe only. Some will, but a larger amount will be produced in countries with a lot of space, a lot of degraded land, with the right climates, and that's all over the world. There are tremendous projects already ongoing in South America. We have on a smaller scale, but definitely a lot of plans and the first projects ongoing in Africa. And myself, I'm also working in Indonesia and investigating locations with a large amount of degraded land where crops and trees can grow that can produce seeds, oil seeds. So there's a lot going on. Investments from the fuel companies are tremendous. They are driving most of the investments. We also see with the high oil prices that they make a lot of money these days. We have seen the quarterly reporting that's tremendous. So they can invest that money. It does not all come from the taxpayers. In the end, of course, the taxpayer will also pay a bit more for his fuel. But that's also to be determined in the sense that the fuel price in Europe is largely on taxes, and the more biofuels, the less taxes. So the European government has still a lot of mechanisms to keep fuel price at a certain level. The cost price of that material will increase, and it's to be seen if that cost price will be forwarded in the final consumer price, or that governments, bring the price levels together. It all depends on the policies that the European legislators have. But important to say that we see tremendous amounts of demand for biomass in Europe. It's likely that other countries will do similar legislation. We see America is coming big. We see in Asia, in Singapore, Japan, Korea, a lot of ambitious legislation being developed and a lot of activities already to find locations, especially locations where nothing else is growing, and we have millions and millions of hectares on the world of these locations, but they're often remote and not easy to develop. The kind of biomass that you're going to use, and the crops and the trees that you're going to grow there on a larger scale, it's never been done before. It brings certain risks, so you have to do investments on very risky locations, but also on risky biotechnology. But there's no other way, and it's not available today. These amount of biomass that are produced and growing on the conditions that the EU legislation sets are not available today, and we have to create them. And if you create them in the right way, as I mentioned, it has only positive effects on not the emissions that you reduce with the biofuels, but also with the capturing of CO2 in the forests and creating a better environment on locations where people and other animals can benefit from. Further recast, I think I mentioned to you, RED 2 was implemented or agreed on by the end of 2018, implemented this year, and politicians here in Europe have been tremendously ambitious. First, they announced the Green Deal, tremendous stimulus package, and on top of that, the Fit for 55. In principle, these are all stimulus packages with a lot of, say, government investments in the energy transition, in the reduction of greenhouse gases, but alongside legislation is being implemented where industries are forced to reduce their energy consumption and fuel companies to change from the use of fossil fuels to biofuels. A couple of things, numbers have been implemented and published. It's not all agreed on. The decision processes in Europe are very complex. We are 27 member states. We have an own parliament. We have a commission, daily government, but those 27 member states represented, by the individual countries, the member states have a say on how the final legislation should look like. You can imagine that countries as Sweden are not happy with a compromise where the ambitions are very low. On the other hand, we have countries, and a bit more developing countries with a very traditional industry, who say it goes much too fast. We cannot pay for that. We have no money. We cannot afford it. And then you have to agree, and a compromise is being built. And that takes sometimes years in Europe. But the outcome, I mentioned 14% goes to almost 30%. It's likely that it's going to be these numbers. These were recently published last month. We still need a couple of months negotiating in Brussels before it's going to be turned into final numbers and legislation. But we can bet on that it's going to be in this direction. So it's going to be even much more ambitious. That brings the numbers significantly higher, as I mentioned that in the earlier slide. And that brings European fuel companies going along the world, finding for locations where they can create biomass and find waste material. But also waste materials are limited at a certain point. I mean, you only have so much waste of everything. And that is pretty clear, that's pretty calculated. The technology is being prepared to use that waste, so that process will definitely go on, but you need much more biomass beyond that to come and reach those targets. So you will see also in Indonesia and other Asian countries, a lot of projects that, initially could not start or grow, but with the investments from the industry, it creates possibilities to do much more reforestation. Reforestation is extremely expensive. All the countries have committed in the Paris Agreement to do a lot of reforestation and to work on degraded land. Often that does not completely happen what they have committed because it's tremendously expensive. And you will see now that the industry is going to take a lot of share in doing that because they just have to. And it's revolutionary what we're going to see in the coming decades. And if you do it in the right way, I think all parties can benefit from that. Then I have a few slides. And again, we go a little bit in depth on the classification of feedstocks, because I just mentioned feedstocks should come from degraded land and not from food consumption, food source production, and many more technical details. And with that, you're going to have sort of a classification. And on top of the classification, you're going to have some sort of an auditing system. And that's already all in place. Organizations that control where feedstock is coming from and in which category it falls and what benefits you can have. And that creates a whole, say, auditing and legislative industry on top of the real industry, the real material, to organize this all. It's easier said than done, and it's hard to determine if the material ends up in a vegetable oil, if it comes from that source or a food source. So it has to be traced to the absolute place where it is basically growing. And with that, you come to all kinds of classifications. I think earlier in the presentations, you have heard about the sources. Fuels based on woody biomass material, on agrofuel material, forestry material, and municipality waste material. Those are big categories. If you talk about bioenergy, you not only talk about food, you have a lot of solid bioenergy for electrifications and other production. It comes in gaseous forms. So it's not straightforward. It's a matter of source, technology, and end use. You need to have energy and materials for fuels, for transportation, but also for the production of electricity and other products. So I'm not going to too much into details. I think you heard a lot about these. And I talk more about legislation and legislation focused on feedstock sources. And able to emphasize that, I have a slide as well on technology. I come later to that. I now give a couple of examples of approved feedstock sources, which some are already used and others are being developed, that are considered waste and that are falling in the category Annex 9A of the legislation, from which the oil companies have to blend in 3.5% or actually 1.7%. In Indonesia, you have a tremendous palm oil production I think it's about 50 million tons. In the production, you have different streams of material, but in the end, you use a lot of water in the production process by cleaning the bread fruit bunches, and that water contains, in the end, oil that is collected in what they call a pond, a little lake, and what you see there is water with cellulosic material and a few percent of oil. If you skim that oil off, because oil comes to the surface, it's lighter, then you call it palm oil mill effluent oil, and that oil is considered a waste. It is not produced by purpose. It's just a side product, a waste product of the production of palm oil. And therefore, because it's defined as a waste, it's classified as a waste, it can be used in the production of biofuels in Europe. Earlier, it was hardly not used, or it was a little skimmed off and locally used, but there was absolutely no value in this oil, and therefore much oil was left in the water and had to degrade over time in the ponds. So it was basically also damaging for the environment. So it's a good thing to separate that oil from the wastewater and use it again. Because it's just a very little bit of oil in comparison to the total oil production. It's also limited available. We estimated on 1.2, 1.3 million tons. My intern has done a lot of calculations on that, a lot of discussions with the palm oil industry. But what you see today is a tremendous development of material, which was never looked at, never spent much time on. And basically all palm oil producing factories with a wastewater system are separating the oil from the waste system, or having plans to do that and sell that material to Europe because it has a lot of value in Europe. So now, because there is value, it's being executed and collected and used. And the value is based on legislation. The European fuel producers have to find those waste sources and have to use those waste sources to produce their fuels in a growing amount. They have defined this as a waste material and developed the industry now. And well, I was in Indonesia in May, and I talked to a lot of players in this industry, and it's a big topic in Indonesia. So therefore, I mentioned this as an example. I myself have a history in pine chemicals. Crude tall oil is a waste product from pulp and paper production. A pine tree consists, next to cellulosic materials and lignocellulosic materials, it has a little bit of fatty material and resin material. That material, when you produce and take a pine tree and you cut it in pieces and prepare for the pulp production and paper production, you skim and you separate in a certain technology a product, a dark liquid, which is considered crude tall oil. If you run that through a biorefinery, you separate the resins from the fatty material, the fatty acids. We call it tall oil fatty acids. And these products are today already being used in the production of biodiesel, advanced biodiesel. That happens with dedicated refineries in Scandinavia. I've worked in one of those refineries in the past. There's just opening a new refinery this month, and the US is building another refinery. So this is typically a waste product that is already being used and is categorized in Annex 9A in the legislation and creates a value. So you can invest money to produce a factory to separate the crude tall oil from the pulp and paper process, because the material that you get out has a value and creates a company that makes good profits. And therefore, there are investments ongoing to create more tall oil for fuel production. Then, you know, in the palm oil, but every fatty vegetable oil production, you use a bleaching earth to take out a few components out of the oil. That is a solid material, and you get some sort of a cake after filtering. And in that cake material, there's a few percent of oil. You can extract that. Up till now, it was just burnt with the cake. You can extract that oil out, and with that, you can have about 720,000 tons worldwide of feedstock for biofuels. Again, it was never looked at. Now it has a waste, a value, and when it has a value, you can invest in a factory to separate that and sell that oil to the fuel industry. And that's how basically legislation creates a market, and the industry will develop that market to make money out of it. And that's exactly what the European Union wants. They want to develop those industry. Initially, they're risky. The technology has to develop. And once it becomes a mature industry, probably the incentives from the EU and the double count mechanism and the tax mechanisms will be lower when it's a mature industry. So it's a stimulus package for a certain time to develop that. But that's basically what is already ongoing. These 3 examples. Well, I talked about the fact that also all the waste in materials that we have in the world are not enough to create biofuels that, you know, should replace the fossil fuels in a way in our cars, but in the future in our planes and ships, that you know, we do not need oil anymore for that. Other technologies are developed, but that will take a long time. And biofuels and the technology to create biofuels or biokerosene or sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, as they call it. The technology is there. The factories are there and being built and grow. The quality is exactly the same as the kerosene that comes from the fossil fuel. Only more sources need to be developed. And we see the first projects of trees that produce seeds. Those seeds contain oil. Palm oil is an example, but palm oil, or the oil palms that are African oil palms used, only grow in certain areas where we don't want to take away more forests. So the end of the universities and research institute develop trees that grow on drier areas, on areas with, you know, less fertile ground, typical degraded areas. The yields of those trees, the amount of seeds and oil they produce is going to be less, and therefore in the past it was never interesting to develop those. We have seen improvement in those trees. That means that we can create higher yields, but also with the incentives that the legislation pays for these materials, it is able to create and invest tremendous amounts of money in reforestation with all kinds of trees that also produce oil seeds and grow on areas where today nothing is growing, basically. And these are things that I'm working on as well. Pongamia tree is a native species tree that grows from India to Australia and everything in between, also native in Indonesia. There are all kinds of trial plots already ongoing in Indonesia, and they try to expand that and grow them in areas where nothing else is growing. We have another production, which is very large in Indonesia, but also in Thailand and Vietnam. It's the production of natural rubber. But those trees are grown for latex production, and they tap that latex, but they also have produced seeds which contain oil. Not much is done with that. Therefore, it's also like considered a waste the trees are planted for rubber and not for oil production. So it can be considered to be a waste. And we are investigating also with Dr. Yusuf, how can we organize basically the collection of those seeds at the plantations, at larger plantations, but also at the smallholder plantations to create, extra additional income for the farmers and create oil to be used in fuel where it's not used today. And those seeds, they fall on the ground, they rot, and they emit the CO2, and they have very little contribution to anything. So the use of this material would be great. On the right side, we have jatropha, and jatropha is very notorious. I cannot say famous, but notorious in Indonesia, because there was a big hype about 14 to 12 years ago, 2007, 8, 2010, with a big stimulus package from the governments in Indonesia to start growing jatropha, because it's a plant that produces a lot of oil, and therefore you don't need to use fossil fuel. A lot of people tried, but it didn't grow fast enough, and nobody collected the seeds for oil. And then the fuel prices and the world oil prices went down very much, and they couldn't produce those trees and the oils from the trees at a cost price anymore that was interesting enough, and all the initiatives basically failed. And today has a very negative image, and we have done a lot of visits in different sites in Indonesia where they tried it. Different islands, and last month a group of people from us were visiting on the islands of Sumba and Timor to see the last jatropha plants standing there and not being collected, and a whole research was done why, and there are many reports from different universities and PhD students and so forth that what went wrong, and there are a few conclusions. At the same time, there are a few companies and universities around the world, but very little, basically 2 to 3, who continue to develop this tree into a higher yielding, more drought tolerant, resistant tree. So there are versions or acrotypes created which produce better amounts of oil seeds, and that's not known, or very little known. But the first of those plantations, there's a plantation in Ghana already, which is giving fantastic yields. And if you grow the plants in the right way, follow the right protocols, then it has very interesting yields. If you put on top of that if you can grow them on land where nothing else grows, that the European fuel producers are willing to invest in it and to pay a significant amount of money, which they were not able to pay 40 years ago. This bio development technology has a tremendous advantage and possibilities to fill a big gap of the missing amount of biomass and feedstock that is today and in the future necessary to comply with the legislation that we just agreed upon. So I see fantastic initiatives going on. A few companies are doing announcements, like ENI is investing in 3-4 countries in Africa to grow plants and trees that produce oil seeds. And there's a tremendous project in South America ongoing with the Pongamia tree. We talk about over 100,000 hectares in the country of Paraguay. There are native palm trees that I don't mention here, which also don't need to grow in tropical areas, but grow on other places which produce oil trees. Maybe not always, or not at the yields that the African palm does in the areas in Indonesia and Malaysia, but it's also not necessary to have such an efficient process, because the price that can be paid for the oil can be much higher due to new legislation. And that's the game changer. And I think that will drive a lot of investments and a lot of new reforestation And part of that's going to be in Indonesia, I'm sure. Part of that's going to be in Africa, in African countries, where there is also a lot of problems with, land erosion, droughts, climate change. We need those trees, but who's going to pay for it? And this is a solution. If you do reforestation, you can sell your carbon credits, and you get money for capturing carbon. And airliners today are compensating their emissions with those credits, but also industries. The biggest carbon credit purchaser today is Microsoft, who wants to have a complete climate neutral process. It's a very, say, wealthy company, profitable company, so they can afford easily to compensate their energy uses by buying those credits. On top of that, if the fuel companies are buying the seeds at a high price, then you get a forestation business model that did not exist in the past and will make a big growth. And if you follow the legislation, which you have to be in the right classification for the legislation in Europe, but I think we will see similar legislation in other countries, then you have to grow them in land where nothing else is growing. So the local population, the quality of the land, a lot of things benefit from that. So I think this is all coming. This is all related to the biofuel industry. It goes hand in hand with the technology developments. But basically, if you want to do the energy transition, you have to do everything. There's no way you can choose for only one technology and whatever. You have to use a lot of biomass as well in the mix. That is a certainty. You can turn that in a positive in the way that the legislation today is developed. And with that, you will see that a lot of, economic activity will develop, reforestation, a lot of jobs, a lot of auditing and legislation related jobs will be created. Our company is, spending more time on this topic than it did 5 years ago when we started, 6 years ago, because at that time there was no interest yet. And basically the fuel companies now need all people who have knowledge of reforestation or the production of these fuels and these plants. So I think some of you, or even if you graduate from ITB with this technology, you will find great jobs, interesting jobs, and in accordance with the philosophy of your generation. Basically, you have to make the world a better place, and fight climate, and make sure that your children are gonna have a nice planet to live on as well. So that's basically my story. I mentioned somewhere today that I can touch upon technology a little bit, but most of them that has been done already. There's a lot of confusion with the new legislation that we talk about first generation and second generation biofuels. We talk about advanced and non-advanced, sometimes related only to the technology, to the way of producing the biofuel, the type of factory, and that's in the middle. The legislation is very much focused on the use of the feedstocks and the raw materials, and with that, the classification. You need both technologies, or the technologies mentioned here, and I assume explained in earlier presentations. You need them all to blend in more biofuel and give the same properties to the material and have the engine run on the same way. You can blend in a lot of fame in Indonesia because it's a warm climate, but you cannot do that in colder places like Scandinavia. So you need HVO. And you also want to use the existing refineries by, mixing, by co-processing, mixing in biomass. So basically you need all the technologies, but the technologies, the factory as such, do not determine what the qualification is of the biofuel. It is the feedstock and where the feedstock comes from that determines the qualification. And that's basically what we indicate in this slide. Here you see a bit of the comparison between the two. I don't want to spend too much time on that. A few slides before I end up to tell you a little bit about the incentives and penalties that the legislation brings. I've done a lot of calculation work on what the cost could be of raw materials. And the fuel companies really look at the legislation, and they look at the fact that they have to blend in so many liters in this year of this material to comply with the legislation. But what happens if you don't comply? And secondly, we have something in Europe called taxonomy. We have a tremendous amount of different taxes on fuel. It's very different from Indonesia. I think up to recently, fuels in Indonesia were subsidized. I think that's not the case anymore, or almost not anymore. But from, having the government pay a little for the cost of the fuel to earning tax income out of the fuel, it's a step. And in Europe, 70% of the consumer price at the gasoline station is based on taxes. So the government has a game to play if they put the tax on the biofuel part lower than on the fossil fuel to make the cost of the biofuel more attractive and at the gasoline pump. Because even if the cost price of the material is higher, if the taxes on top of the cost price are lower, then in the end, the fuel company can make more out of the biofuels. And that's currently what's happening. That is extremely complicated. Not complicated in the sense that step by step you cannot learn about it and understand it. It is because you have so many categories and you have so many classifications. So you have the market prices of feedstocks, then you have the legislation in different countries, you have the mandates, the sub-mandates, and then also the amount of tax that the government puts on the fuel. My intern David and myself, we worked on it, we talked about it, we tried to collect it, and we tried to also show the different categories based on the names, because you see a lot of listings of FAME production, methyl ester production, and on hydrotreated vegetable oil production. And there are many reasons why prices are what they are, but and this slide, it takes me too much time to go over every category, but I've said in the beginning, if you look at food and feedstock, I mean the soya, palm, and rapeseed oils, they are going to be limited. So you only can blend in so much of that material. There is enough of that material in Europe. It does not harm the food production. There is enough in principle, so that is a free market price. And because you can only use so much, it is kind of low. You can use these feedstocks in producing of FAME or HVO. The engines in Europe and the legislation, technically different legislation, but you can only blend in 7% of FAME in a car. If the legislation says you have to go to 14 or 29, what we're going to see, you cannot use FAME anymore in Europe. So you start with that category of material, which is food and feeds-based feedstock, and FAME, which has technical limitations and legal limitations, and that leads to a certain price. HVO can be blended in principle to 100%. Technically, it's identical. So you have to use above 7% HVO. If that also comes from the waste category, you get the sub-mandate that you have to meet. And basically, that creates a very different price. And here you see already a tremendous price category going from under 2,000 to over 3,000 per metric ton, and that's a tremendous difference in price. And that difference can go into reforestation projects, in expensive technology park to produce the biofuel. The whole legislation is designed to allow those developments to happen because they are necessary. I think I could give an whole lecture on how this is designed and developed. You have to understand that few companies in Europe have a separate department these days who do nothing else than calculate the compliance. So calculate, do we purchase enough of this biofuel to mix in that place? It's a tremendous additional activity for the few companies with, software systems and tremendous Excel spreadsheets to really understand if they produce the right amount from the right feedstock and so forth and so forth. And what does that mean for our prices and our profitability? This did not exist 10 years ago. This is very new. Oh, it started 10 years ago, whatever, but did not exist at all 20 years ago. And these compliance departments of few companies with tens of people, it's very new, and it indicates that it's not easily and straightforward done. But if you do it right, and we have a couple of advanced companies, especially in Scandinavia, the Finnish oil company, which is, the most forward company in biofuels, is extremely profitable and does a great job in producing HVO and FAMEs in a different way. Very, very, very ahead of others in finding feedstock sources, in producing in different places in the world, have a tremendous capacity in technology, and that is being rewarded with also good profits. So it becomes a healthy industry also. Tax incentives, as I mentioned, 70%, about 70% of the price that you pay at the gasoline station is tax. Cost price is the rest, and a little profit. You can play with that. Taxes in Europe are very decentralized. 27 member states have different tax systems. To talk about compliance and complexity, that's still not a European thing, taxation. So different countries give different stimulances to reach, say, the targets. But if you take a little of that tax amount of a liter, that's there, and I think we're somewhere over €2 here in Europe. So €1.40 or €1.50 or something like that is based out of taxes, and 50 cents is cost price of the material that you put in your gasoline tank. You can imagine if the government says, okay, I accept for the bio part that you don't pay 70% tax, but only 50, or it even goes to zero at certain places in certain countries now. You have a tremendous amount available to pay for higher raw materials or more complicated production processes, and have a higher cost price of the biofuel, but compensated with a lower tax. And a few examples are being mentioned on the slide here. I mentioned tax penalties. Additionally to the legislation, the member states have implemented penalties. Also, the penalty system is basically per member state. So it's not the same in the whole of Europe, but every country has a different one. Penalties in the beginning were not so high. So when a fuel company did not meet the total volume in that year that they have to blend in on biofuels, and from the total fuel that they sold, and they did not meet, the quantity that they had from the law, they get a penalty for every liter or metric ton that you did not meet, so that you did not blend enough biofuel in the fuel. If that penalty is low, and it costs the fuel company much more to produce that biofuel by purchasing expensive raw materials and using a complicated technology, then people, or a few companies, economically think, okay, I take the penalty, and that's what happens a lot. But recently, in all countries, those penalties went up tremendously, and there is no way that you're basically not going to be complying with the volumes that you need. Otherwise, you have to pay a tremendous amount of money. So did we talk maybe $50 per metric ton? We talk now here in Germany, 800 plus. And well, we have 750 in a country like Italy. It's tremendous. And or you take the penalty, or you purchase the higher raw material cost and produce biofuels. And since there is not only legislation but also the image of the fuel companies, nobody want to be in the news or in the newspaper with a headline saying Shell does not meet their blending mandates and get a penalty of so many millions or whatever. That's also not only expensive and economically non-attractive, it's also image-wise not acceptable anymore. So the driver to produce those biofuels, the legislation, which is demanding the tremendous growing amounts that we need, but also the financial model that is connected to the legislation with penalties and taxation, makes this development unstoppable. It's happening. It's being taken serious. Few companies hire tremendous amount of people to make this happen. Billions and billions of investments are really physically happening. I mean, I can almost look out of the window and I see the cranes of the refineries that are being reconstructed for biorefineries here in Europe. With the stimulus package in the US, and things already going there, it's very similar. I hear similar stories from Japan, Australia, and other countries coming. So there's going to be a tremendous industry for this, but if you do it right, and that's the intention of the legislators, to make sure that the energy transition and the use of biomass is without negative side effects or unexpected effects, then I think everyone can benefit from it. And yeah, that's what I basically want to talk about today. I summarize it with a few sentences. The introduction and development of traditional biofuels had some negative impact in the environment in terms of biodiversity, food and feed sources. And if you really calculate the reduction of greenhouse gases, it was not that great. So implementation of new innovative legislation in the EU will further grow the biofuel industry, but based on raw material sources that only have a very positive impact on GHG reduction, environment, and biodiversity. Mandatory blending, high penalties, and differentiated tax rates, taxonomy, lower taxes, will enable raw material costs, higher raw material costs, and deconnects basically the competition with the oil price. So where biofuels were very unattractive in times that the oil price was very low, because the cost of biofuels were higher than the cost of traditional fuels, there is no way that these two compete with each other. It is just the fact that with the penalties and the taxation advantages, biofuels are mandatory blended, and there is no way that it still competes with the traditional oil price. And that's a game changer tremendously. It's the taxonomy and it's the penalties which determine if you are going to execute the legislation. And trust me, it's designed in a way now that all fuel companies are fully committed to the new legislation. For this, as a result of all this, there's a tremendous amount of biomass necessary in the coming years to comply with these mandates. These biomass must be produced in tremendous amount, according to a tremendous amount of rules to avoid negative impact on all kinds of matters. And lots will come from reforestation because there is not enough waste to meet all those quantities. But reforestation is very expensive. Reforestation on degraded land is something that we all agreed in the United Nations Framework Convention to do, and does not happen enough. But with the necessity to create forest and find biomass for fuels, with the incentives, with the final consumer paying the whole price of their fuel, I believe it will happen much more and it will grow very fast. That's basically what I wanted to talk about today. Thank you.